What's up, Buttercups? My name is Caitlin Donald, and I am one of the museum educators at the Dubuque Museum of Art. This is the next video in the Art Adventures program. And today, I really wanted to talk about Scrimshaw. Now, a lot of you guys have probably seen Scrimshaw before, but you didn't know that that's what it was called. This is Scrimshaw. It's considered to be one of the only truly American folk arts, which is kind of cool. It's something that we in the United States can kind of own as our own thing in the art world. And what Scrimshaw actually is it's the decoration of bone or ivory-like objects like tusks or shells or baleen or antlers. And a lot of it was done in the 1700s, 1800s. So let's start by just talking about some super cool history. Scrimshaw was kind of born from the whaling industry in the 1600s and the 1700s. And by this point, the Americans and the Northern Europeans were overwhelmingly in control. By the 1700s, whaling ships actually became kind of like floating factories. So they could not only catch a whale, but they could process it in the boat. And this was a crazy, crazy new thing, because what this meant was you could catch a whale, and then you could catch another whale, and then you could catch another whale, and you could continue to process it in the boat. And you can fill up these giant barrels with the whale oil. So that meant that you could catch multiple whales, but you could also be out at sea for a crazy amount of time. So some voyages would be like 3 to 5 years. You'd be on this boat catching whales. Whale oil at the time was in crazy high demand. So it was used for like a ton of different stuff. So it was used to make hoop skirts for fancy ladies. So these big, big skirts that you see in old movies that poof way, way out, they have what's called baleen in them. And baleen is kind of this bone-like stuff that's in the whale. They would also make corsets with baleen. Look how thin. But look at this. So they'd sew the baleen into the corset. They would use the whale oil as lubricant for machinery, but the main thing they would actually use it for is light. So if you've ever heard the phrase burning the midnight oil, it means you're working late at night and you need light. Because this is way before electricity, right? This is before you could just walk into your kitchen to get a midnight snack and flick on the light, get some ice cream, and go back to bed. This is way before that. And so this was the main reason that whales were hunted down, was for light. Whaling itself was extremely dangerous. A lot of people got hurt because you're hunting like a giant animal. This is a giant animal that will fight back if it's harmed, just like any of us. And so it was extremely exciting and extremely dangerous and extremely adventurous for these sailors. But remember, they're out for 3 or 5 years. 3, 4, 5 years. That's a long time. And they can go months without seeing a whale. So there were these kind of like airport moments, I call them, where you are really bored and you're sitting there and you're sitting there and you're sitting there, and then all of a sudden you got to do something. You got to board a plane, or you got to go get your luggage, or you got to do something exciting. And it's kind of the same thing for these sailors. They were very, very bored for months on end, and then all of a sudden they had to get up and they had to perform these extremely dangerous, very fast-paced tasks. And then they'd be bored for another 3 months. And so whaling ships had a lot of two things. And that was, one, they had a lot of boredom, a lot of nothing to do. But they also had a lot of teeth and a lot of bones. And so they would start to draw on them. And this became one of the most popular ways to kind of fill time. So the captains of these early whaling ships realized very early on that boredom was a really bad thing for the men on these crews, because you're not in, something the size of a mall. You're in something the size of maybe a small apartment with all of these people, and there's not much to do. So what would end up happening is the men would drink, they would fight, they would get into mischief, they would get into trouble, and it was a big problem. And so the captains of these ships would really encourage getting all that pent-up energy and getting it out on these objects, on these things that they could carve up. The earliest Scrimshaw samples were kind of around the late 1600s, but the craft was the highest point, or it peaked in the late 1700s, early 1800s. This is actually a dolphin skull that a sailor had carved into and engraved on, which is really cool. A lot of times, the sailors would do images of boats, they would do images of whales, they'd do images of things that they saw around them, things that they were experiencing, but they would also draw images of things they missed. So if you look in the middle, you can see someone drew their family, or their girlfriend, or their wife. They would draw religious symbols to kind of comfort themselves on these crazy long months that you're not learning anything, you're not doing really much, you're just sitting and waiting. And that's kind of what I really love about Scrimshaw, is it shows not just a picture, but a really cool story of how these men spent their time, what they cared about, what they wanted to put on an object. And what I also really, really like about these objects is they're not professional artists, right? So these guys, they're not painters, or some of them probably were, but for the most part, they were just regular working guys that were out hunting these whales. And so it's kind of cool because you can see a sailor at the beginning of his journey, year one, and he's drawing on a whale tooth, and it's not that good. But 5 years later, after being on a whaling boat, he gets pretty good at drawing, which is kind of cool. It's kind of like the fanciest version of doodling that was ever invented. Another thing that these guys would do is they would collect extra income. So they not only would make things that would remind them of home, they not only would make things that they could give to their wives when they got home, or their families, but they would make things that they could sell. So when they finally got to port in a different area, they could sell these objects, these tools, or these jewelry pieces. A lot of times pie crust kind of carvers were super, super popular. But here is, a bunch of carving tools. In the back, there's a saw. Here's a compass made out of whalebone. And a lot of times this stuff would all have decorations on it. It would all have carvings or artwork or something on it. And by selling it at ports around the world or around the country, they could make a little extra income, send it back to their families, or buy a little extra something at the port. It was a nice kind of financial buffer for these guys. So let's pretend that you are a sailor in the 1700s. So we can pretend you can pick a guy, whichever guy you want to be. I want to be this guy. I'll be this guy with the little hat. So you're going to pretend to be this sailor from the 1700s. And you haven't seen your wife in like 4 years and you're really getting tired of this lifestyle, but you're making good money. You just caught a whale. So you guys just hunted a whale with your buds. You brought it up to the ship. It was processed. Everything is good. And now you're ready to find another whale. And it's been, now you have to start the 3-month wait of finding another whale. If you're lucky. It could be 4 months. So you're sitting down and your captain starts walking around. And he starts handing out these whale teeth. These whale teeth. And now you have to, well, now you don't have to, but there's nothing else for you to do. So what you're going to do is you're going to start processing the tooth. You want to make it into something cool, right? So the first thing you do is you're going to take your knife and you're going to get all the rough spots off. Any gross stuff that's caked on, anything that's really hard, or anything that's not really supposed to, that's not a part of the tooth. And then you're going to take shark skin, which is kind of like the ocean sandpaper, and you're going to sandpaper it down with that shark skin. And then finally, you're going to use a piece of leather to really get it nice and shiny and smooth. And after all of that, then you can finally start drawing. So what are you going to draw with? So you have this tooth. What do you think you are going to draw with? Most people would draw with a knife, or they would draw with what's called sail needle. And a sail needle is exactly what it sounds like. It's a needle that they would use on the ship's sails, the ship's canvas sails. So it's very, very tough. But it's also extremely sharp. And so you can use it for all these like really, really fine details, these tiny, tiny little lines. So you drew on your tooth. But how are you going to get the drawing to show up, right? Because at this point, there's no pigment. There's no color to it. It's just lines that are kind of etched into the surface. So most of the time, what Scrimshaw artists would do, or what these sailors would do, is they would take excess whale oil or kind of gross whale oil that wasn't really wanted, and they would combine that with carbon, which is kind of like this dusty, very black substance. And they would rub that into the tooth. They would rub it and rub it, rub it. Then they would wipe down the surface, and all of this would be clean, but the ink would stay in these little lines. And sometimes they could use different colors. So on occasion, they would find or catch an octopus, and they would actually use the octopus ink, the distraction ink that these guys kind of spit out. They would use that. Sometimes they would use berries that they found at different ports. Sometimes they would use exotic teas, different things to get different colors. And so, again, this is kind of what's really cool about Scrimshaw, is it's all kind of duct taped together. It's this very strange thing where it's just a bunch of guys being creative and using what they have on the boat. Because you're at sea, you might not have, oil paints, or you don't have, like a whole bunch of colored pencils. You just have what you have, or what you can find, or what you can fish. And then you have to be creative with that. And so there's a lot of reasons why I really love Scrimshaw. Sorry, my voice is all scratchy. I found this the other day, which is a modern Scrimshaw kit. A lot of hunters are now kind of doing Scrimshaw, which is really cool, with like deer antlers or the deer bones after they've kind of eaten the deer meat. So it's making a comeback in the modern age, which is really neat. A lot of that was due to President Kennedy, who had a huge collection of antique Scrimshaw, and he was very proud of it, and he would show it off. And so he kind of brought it back into the modern eye. The whaling industry kind of died out due to overfishing, and also due to better technology and new inventions like electricity, things like kerosene and petroleum. And so as that died down, a lot of these Scrimshaw sailors kind of stopped. They didn't stop making things, I'm sure, but they stopped making Scrimshaw out at sea. So that is kind of my Scrimshaw video. Again, I really, really like Scrimshaw. It's one of those things that I think is really unique. It's something that's truly an American craft. It's something that was made by common people that, you know, weren't in the art world necessarily, but still wanted to be creative. It was something that told very personal stories about how these men lived and how they lived so differently from all of us today. And they also, you know, it shows the creativity of these men, that not only are they making these pictures, but the things they made these pictures out of. They basically made it out of sea trash. Things that they found, things that they had to kind of put together. They had to figure out how to carve. They figured out how to add ink. They figured out all these things. And so I think Scrimshaw is a very, very, very cool aspect of art that kind of gets overlooked. So again, this was a very, very casual video, just kind of me talking to the camera, not really having a script, just kind of showing you cool pictures I like and different things. So I hope that you guys learned something. I hope that you had fun listening. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have any topics you want me to talk about, let me know. If you guys make anything. So I'm assuming you guys don't have a massive collection of bones and whale paraphernalia at your house, you know. Like, if you do, it's illegal, for one, but two, I'm sure you don't have just a bunch of stuff laying around that you can use to make your own actual Scrimshaw. But as always, you can always draw a tooth and then draw what you think, if you were a sailor, you would make. So if you're a kid and you're watching, I want you to think about what it would actually be like to be on a boat for 4 years, and what it would actually be like to hunt a whale, and what it would actually be like to make art about that and have to carve into something because you're so bored. So I guess that's my video. I will see you guys later. Peace out.